All right, guys, welcome to the video. Today we're going to talk about Arthur Primary, some possible pairings that nobody has talked about yet that actually might be good. I'm not sure, but we're going to test and we're going to find out. And we're going to talk about just some of the theory behind it. We're also going to talk about the combo tree. Most people are actually making a mistake with the combo tree. They're picking a talent that's just not that good. We'll go over why. And then we'll cover a bunch of stuff in between. All right, so we'll go over some big picture concepts, which I'll weave into this discussion. I'll talk about some of the background as far as the testing I've done on this commander. I think Arthur came out January 10th. I was actually able to test him less than 2 weeks later in KVK pretty extensively with the reports manager. And the reports manager is actually what you see over here, right? You can actually, with the new updated reports manager from Cubist Mike, plug in him. Not only can you see how your March trades relative to each other, but you can actually start also calculating the average sub wound reports per report, right? And those two are very, very important because now you can actually take open field results and then do a lot of data, compile them over time, and then make a better judge of how good a March is, right? So for example, before we tend to do duels or arc practice matches or even the battle simulator. But then if you keep running those, really, really good March, like Lucha Alex will just fall through the cracks. So he doesn't shine in any of those scenarios, right? But anyone who's used Lucha Alex on the field just knows like his reports are just ridiculous. And you can only actually really get that info by running him the field and then actually compiling the reports. So the reports manager is able to do that, right? We'll talk about some of the limitations for Arthur as a primary, just why he's kind of limited as a primary commander, and then because of pairing and because it's just his kit. We'll actually talk about the talent build, what I think is the best talent build for a combo tree, and then finally we'll talk about some possible pairings. All right, so first let's go over some concepts. All right, the first concept I would like for people to kind of think through is the idea of trades versus your actual output, right? So trades is essentially like your KP ratio, right? So if you're doing like 3-to-1, 4-to-1, that's amazing, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the whole picture because how much damage is this March actually doing versus how much damage is actually taking, right? So with the reports manager, you can actually start doing like the average sevs, and obviously a lot of it could seem a lot lower, right? Because if you go out, you get cheeseburger once, that report's like very, very low, but it's going to count towards one of your reports. All right. But when you're able to keep track of reports over a bunch of different scenarios, right, you can actually start tracking the average sevs. And if you have for example, like a March, like on the screen here, these are actual numbers from when I was testing them, right? If Nevsky Belly, for example, which is actually pretty good, is averaging dealing 1,316 sevs per report, and Arthur Phillip is doing almost like 2.8, 2.7 times that, right? He's doing a massive amount of damage, even though the KP ratio is worse than Nev Belly. If you give me the option of the two, right, I will actually take the one that trades worse, right, is a little squishier, but deals a lot more damage as part of my 7 March murder ball, for example, right? So it's really important though to understand just because a March trades good doesn't actually mean it's a March that you want to use. I think a good example for that would be like Attila Tegeda, right? Even in 2025, he'll still trade well, but that March would trade well, but its DPS is just too low, and it's just not really worth using in your murder ball. So as we're discussing some of this stuff, it is very important that whatever March you pick, it better be bringing some really, really amazing buff debuff, and it still needs damage, right? But if it's not, it has to actually do a high amount of damage for it to be worth using in 2025. All right, next is the idea of anti-swarm versus tankiness. Okay, so I think people confuse those two together just because you really wouldn't want to target an anti-swarm or a tanky commander on the field, right? Just because for the anti-swarm, it's going to hurt when you hit it, but the tanky commander, as you're hitting it, it's actually not going to go down as fast. And then if you're targeting a much squishier March, for example, like a XY, right, on the field, you can actually drop that March a lot faster, so it's worth it to target something else like that's not very tanky, right? So, but they're different. So, for example, Attila is a very anti-swarm commander. He has a lot of normal damage, His kit allows him to boost his counterattack damage. If you hit him, it's going to hurt. But besides a little bit of like skill damage reduction, Attila actually has no defensive capability. So if you hit him and he's not paired with someone that's very tanky, he's going to go down really, really quick. Which is actually one of the reasons why I'm not really convinced that Attila Subutai is necessarily the best pairing for Subutai as a rally. Just because Subutai just has the 30% defense, I do wonder if there's like another pairing that's maybe a little bit more balanced that can sustain a little bit better on the field as a rally that people haven't discovered yet, right? But Attila is anti-swarm. A commander like Ragnar Prime is tanky, right? He has a bunch of stats. He also has a bunch of just damage reduction in his kit, but he actually has very little anti-swarm capability, right? But I think besides the vampire effect where he gains some attack, he's actually not that prickly to hit. It'll just take a little bit longer than almost every other commander to bring him down because of his tanky kit, right? So this will kind of build on to the idea when we talked about Arthur Primary, because Arthur by himself just has 20% health. It's okay, but he's actually on the squishier side. And so far, our pairings for Arthur Primary is mostly Philip and William, right? Those commanders have, again, almost no defensive capability, like none for Philip. You could barely count it as defense for William because his active skill needs to go off, and then he buffs the defense for X amount of seconds. Really, there's just no tankiness, right? So I do wonder if the best pair for Arthur Primary actually is a commander that's a little bit more tanky that we just haven't talked about yet, right? Finally, let's go over the idea of a minimum viable threshold. Okay, so really for anything, like there needs to be a minimum. It could be better, but if you can't actually hit the minimum, then you're just not good enough, right? So for example, ZL YSG theoretically should do a crap load of damage on the field, but it's just not being used by anyone. And the main reason is just because there's no march speed, right? So archers are faster than infantry, but when you just don't have a baseline or a minimum viable threshold of march speed, the march is virtually just unusable, right? Because one, it'll take you forever to actually hit the target, but if you're even a little out of position, you won't be able to get away. And then if you're so slow, by the time you actually connect to the target, maybe the other marches are already in a bad position and you need to readjust. It's just not viable enough, right? So I bring up this idea because I do wonder for Arthur and say Philip, or Arthur and William, are they actually maybe at or close to that barely being minimum viable, right? As far as their tankiness, that if you bring a commander that's slightly more tanky and crosses over that threshold, overall the results will actually be better, right? So to be determined. So let's go over a little background, right? So here, these are actually numbers that I did about 2 months ago now in my Orleans KVK. I did it in zone 5, so the first zone where we had fighting, when there was just one auxiliary skill. I didn't want to do any more testing past the first auxiliary skill, just because you can start really like compensating for a commander's weakness once you got further and further along. But these were the actual numbers, right? So I did 2 things when I was testing that. One, I wanted to test a bunch of different Arthur pairings, and 2, I wanted to test a bunch of different Philip pairings. This one, I mostly wanted to just show the Arthur pairings because this video is about Arthur. But you can see actually, and this order is actually ordered by the KP ratio. The number over here in this row, the reports, when I was doing it, on average, I was getting about, I want to say about like 400 reports per 4 hours playing. Okay, so if you see like 400 reports, that means it's about 4 hours of running that march on the field. You can see over here, Arthur Phillip, 200 reports, right? I was able to just run that march on the field for about 2 hours to actually, compile the results, right? So here you can see Joan Arthur actually ended up trading the best with Nevsky Belly second. That actually ended up being the direction I wanted to go with for my 2 cab marches. I actually ended up running Joan Arthur and then Nev Belly for the rest of that KVK, and I actually did pretty well, right? But you can also see a bunch of other numbers here. The one that really stands out, and I want you to see the 2 that are underlined, is Arthur Phillip and Arthur William, right? At the time, the whole idea was that, okay, if Lucia Alex is really good, right? Basically, you have a big damage dealer that's, that has combo attack, and then you put an instant proc commander behind them, you kind of recreate that Lucia Alex magic. Maybe we could do that with Arthur Phillip and Arthur William because they both have an instant proc. Running those two marches, I ran Arthur Phillip, like I said earlier, 200 reports, about 2 hours. And then I actually did Arthur William for a lot more. I did 684 reports for that. The results I found was that Arthur Phillip was just better, right? If you look at the damage here, it did by far the most average sevs out of any of the marches on this list. And it was actually the highest, even higher than the second place, which was ZL Herman. I think ZL Herman was at about like 2,800. And then my Lucia Alex was at like 2,600 or something. Lucia Alex traded the best overall, but it was actually the third highest in damage dealt. Arthur Phillip was by far the highest. Arthur William, I did run that for 684 reports. The results were kind of just on par with all the other marches, right? It wasn't lower, but it wasn't necessarily that much better. Personally, when I used them pretty extensively, I didn't find them to be that remarkable. So I actually did play around with Arthur Phillip a little bit more in the next zone, and it did all right. But that's actually the extent of me testing Arthur as a primary commander, just because at the time I was pretty fixated on trying to maximize the instant proc. And even though, I noticed that the sev wounds were a little high, especially when I was doing Arthur Phillip, it never really occurred to me to try to mess around with different pairings to maybe get a more tanky option behind Arthur and see how that did. All right, so all of that is to set up. There are some limitations for Arthur as a primary commander right now, right? One, we have Hua and Nevsky, which you could argue are still part of the meta. They work better as primary commanders, right? So if Arthur was primary, Arthur will be fighting with Hua and Nevsky to be primary commanders. And one, it might force you to just bench some Cav commanders that are still really good, but you just don't have room to have 3 Cav commanders all be primary, right? Usually most people at most are running 2. Right? Some of the crazy ones are running 4, but usually it's 2. All right, the second limitation for Arthur primary is that there's not really a natural combo damage pair for Arthur right now, right? Like there's nothing that you look at where you're like, wow, that's really synergistic. Maybe over the next cap cycle, but right now we're just trying to kind of fit theories, right? And I talked about earlier, Arthur Phillip, Arthur William, you're trying to maximize the instant proc, but we never actually explore different other kinds of pairings that might just fit better with Arthur, right? So for example, Arthur is not the tankiest commander. He has 20% health, which is okay, but that's all he has, right? When you pair Arthur with a commander like William or Phillip, which offers no tankiness, that march actually becomes pretty squishy, right? And like as you guys saw with the Arthur Phillip sub wounds, right? I ran this for 200 reports. I noticed it consistently. All the other marches could be still white, and then the Arthur Phillip would just be yellow, right? And it's not necessarily like it was just in a bad position, but it was just when I was taking, say, like AoE, or maybe when it gets like a little bit more on the front lines and someone targets it, it's just taking more damage than the other marches, just because of how squishy it was, right? So if tankiness is a weakness with an Arthur primary march, what if we actually put a more tanky option behind it? Would it actually do better than a more instant proc focus option behind it, right? We don't know because no one's actually tested it. I'm kind of surprised that we haven't seen people test out some of the combos I'm about to suggest to actually see how Arthur primary does if you don't focus so much on the instant proc, you focus on some of the other stuff, right? So which leads me to wonder, is the tankiness of Arthur primary with William and Phillip actually even above the minimum viable threshold? Is it just right around there? Is that actually holding the march back, right? And we actually picked another option with the Arthur primary doing up damage, right? And that's to be determined, right? But let's put a bow on that. Let's actually talk about the Arthur primary talent build, right? So this would be the talent build that I personally would recommend. If you notice here, we're actually going all the way to the top of the cap tree, which you're getting Rallying Cry. Basically, the first 10 seconds of combat, you're going to do 15% more damage, right? So you're actually leaning into that combo attack, instant proc, all that stuff. the first 10 seconds, essentially when you're going in and out of combat, you actually want to do a lot more damage in the beginning, right? I think most people, when they're looking at the combo tree, they actually want to go to the top of the combo tree and take this iron and steel. If I open it up right now, Lilith is telling me 66% of the governors are actually picking the skill. I think it's a mistake, and I'll go over why. All right, so if you read this, whenever this commander's troops launches a combo attack or range combo attack, right, so it actually has to be a combo attack, then it has a 10% chance to launch an extra combo attack. So basically, when you launch a combo attack, which if you're doing Arthur, right, on your active skill, you do 2 in 1 turn, and then you have one for his expertise, which I guess technically could trigger multiple times, but it has a 10-second cooldown. Essentially, over a skill cycle, you probably only have 3 chances to trigger this iron and steel, and then it's a 10% chance to trigger it when you do it, right? So when you start actually doing the math, iron and steel is terrible, because it's not off of a basic attack where you have a 10% chance every turn, which is like, you know, an instant proc. This literally only triggers off of combo attacks, which you're not doing that often. And then also like 2 of them you're doing in the same turn, right? So like, you know, when you have a cooldown, like it does it even like proc? So not only does this take 5 points just to only do 250 damage factor, but there's a 10-second cooldown, and it's triggering off of other combo attacks that you're just not doing that often, right? So to go there, not only do you have to put 5 points here, but you have to put a lot of points along the way for stuff that might not be that good. But I just think the better play for me is to actually go to the top of the calf tree, take Rallying Cry, lean into moving in and out of combat, dealing a lot of instant proc, you know, combo attack damage, kind of like that, to actually get the maximum use out of Arthur, right? You might not agree with Rallying Cry, but I just find it hard for people that actually understand the math for this, the iron and steel, to justify putting this many points for something that's actually triggering off of other combo attacks, which you're just not doing enough of. And there's only a 10% chance to trigger this, and you only do 250 damage factor. You know, I don't see the value for it, right? Finally, let's talk about some possible pairings. The 3 I'm interested, and there could be more, but the 3 I'm most interested in are Nevsky, Belly Prime, and Takeda. Obviously, all 3 are a lot tankier than William or Philip. Nevsky, obviously, is probably the most tanky commander by himself, but Takeda actually brings the most stats. All right, so he has a bunch of defense, I think a 40% defense it brings, but then he also brings a bunch of attack, like 40% attack, I want to say, that Nevsky doesn't bring, right? Belly is interesting because Belly actually has an instant proc. He brings 30% defense. I think it brings like 30 or 40% stat. He's actually pretty well rounded. If I had to take a guess, this is just theory crafting without testing, I think the Belly Prime one will probably do the best overall. But Takeda does a lot of different things that could boost normal damage that, you know, I don't know how well synergize with Arthur Primary. I'm curious. And then Nevsky is just a very like well-rounded, like a lot of stats. You know, he still does like good single target damage, especially as a secondary. He's going to boost that by 60%. He's very, very tanky. And back before Joan came out, a lot of people were running, for example, Attila Nevsky or XY Nevsky, right? You're taking essentially glass cannon or not tanky commanders, and you're putting a very tanky commander behind them like Nevsky, and it made it work. So those 3, you know, I want to actually test them out. I am going to be playing on someone's account this weekend for Kinsland, right? And it's a very, very good account. I'll actually be able to test these out. You know, I'll probably stream it actually, and I'll have reports manager data. And then after testing, I want to find, you know, are these actually good, right? Are they better than Arthur Philip, better than Arthur William? We'll make another video out of it, and I'll report my findings. It could actually not be better. It could actually be worse, right? But I at least want to find out. And the things I'm looking for, not only are the trades, right, but I also, kind of what I talked about earlier, we want to see how much damage it actually does, right? Because if you take away like the instant proc, you just have Arthur Primary with a commander that's tanky, but doesn't necessarily synergize that well with Arthur, right? How are the trades? Is it actually doing enough damage for it to be worth it? So I don't know. I have a feeling Belly Prime will be the pick because he actually does have an instant proc, but it's just, you know, something interesting to think about. And then if you watch all the way to the end, you haven't yet, please like and subscribe to the video. It really helps out the channel. Probably should do this at the beginning. But thank you guys for watching. And I'll talk to you guys next time.